Have you ever put your heart into planning the perfect surprise, only to discover you were the one in for a shock? That's exactly what happened when I decided to fly across the country to surprise my family. After 6 months away, I thought they'd be overjoyed to see me walk through that front door. Instead, I overheard words that stopped me cold. The house feels so peaceful without her. Sometimes the truth hits hardest when it's not meant for your ears. This is the story of how an unexpected homecoming changed everything I thought I knew about my place in my family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, I'd always been the loud one in the Taylor household, the one who filled silent moments with chatter, who brought friends home without warning, who played music too loud, and who somehow managed to take up more space than my physical body should allow. My mother, Diane, would often tease that I had the biggest personality in the smallest package, standing at just 5'2", but somehow commanding attention in any room I entered. When I was accepted to a prestigious journalism fellowship in Seattle 6 months ago, it was the first time I'd ever lived more than 20 minutes from my childhood home. At 26, most of my friends had long moved away for college or jobs, but I'd stayed local for school and then landed a decent position at a Minneapolis marketing firm. The fellowship was my big break, 6 months on the West Coast working with industry leaders, building my portfolio, and finally stepping out from under the comfortable shadow of home. The night before I left, my parents threw a small going-away party. My younger brother Ryan strummed his guitar while my older sister Melissa and her husband brought homemade appetizers. Dad grilled, despite the February chill, and Mom kept hugging me randomly throughout the evening, her eyes misty each time. "You'll call us every Sunday," she said. Not a question, but a command wrapped in motherly concern. Dad was more stoic, clapping me on the shoulder as we stood by the grill. "Show 'em what Taylor women are made of," he said, flipping a burger with unnecessary force, his way of showing he was proud but worried. The fellowship started intensely and never let up. 18-hour workdays, constant deadlines, and the pressure to impress meant those Sunday calls home sometimes got pushed to Monday, then Tuesday, then skipped altogether with apologetic texts. "Sorry, crazy week. Love you all," became my refrain, accompanied by heart emojis that felt increasingly inadequate as the weeks passed. In April, I missed Ryan's birthday entirely, remembering 3 days later with a panicked Amazon gift card. In May, my parents' anniversary came and went without so much as a text until Mom gently mentioned it during our next call. Each time, they were understanding. Too understanding. Their graciousness made me feel worse than if they'd just gotten angry. "We know you're busy building your career, Emma," Mom would say, while Dad would grunt in agreement in the background. "We're just so proud of you." Seattle suited me in unexpected ways. The constant rain that everyone warned me about felt cleansing, washing away the small-town parts of myself I hadn't realized I was eager to shed. I made friends quickly. Other fellows who understood the pressure, local journalists who took me under their wings, neighbors in my apartment complex who invited me to weekly trivia nights. For the first time, I was building a life that was entirely my own, not defined by being the Taylor family's middle child, or Diane and Robert's daughter, or Ryan's sister, or Melissa's little sister. The fellowship was set to end in early August, but my supervisor had hinted strongly that there might be a permanent position waiting for me if I wanted to stay in Seattle. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. When I mentioned the possibility during one of our increasingly rare family calls, there was a pause before anyone responded. "That would be wonderful," Mom finally said, her voice tight. "If that's what you want." "Of course it's what she wants," Melissa chimed in, always the pragmatic one. "It's an amazing opportunity." Ryan said nothing at all, which was unusual for my typically opinionated brother. Dad cleared his throat. Just don't forget where you came from, kiddo. Something in his tone made my chest ache. It was the same voice he'd used when I was 7, and insisted I was running away after being sent to my room. He'd helped me pack my little suitcase, his movements slow and deliberate, telling me which socks would be best for long journeys, and reminding me which way to turn at the end of our street. He knew I wouldn't make it past the big oak tree in the front yard, but he took my 7-year-old rebellion seriously enough to make me feel heard. The memory of that day, and the way I'd unpacked my suitcase without a word after making it only to the end of the driveway, stayed with me through the next few weeks as Seattle's summer bloomed in earnest. 3 weeks before the fellowship ended, my editor assigned me to cover a story that would require traveling to Chicago for 4 days. The timing meant I'd finish the assignment just 2 weeks before the fellowship's conclusion. That's when the idea struck me. Minneapolis was just a short flight from Chicago. Instead of returning directly to Seattle, I could fly home and surprise my family for a quick weekend visit before heading back to wrap up my time in the fellowship. I convinced myself it was the perfect plan. I'd make up for all the missed calls and forgotten birthdays. I'd remind them that despite the distance and my busy schedule, they were still my priority. And selfishly, I wanted to feel that unconditional Taylor family love wash over me again before making any decisions about potentially staying in Seattle permanently. The surprise required careful planning and a co-conspirator. I chose Ryan, who had always been terrible at keeping secrets, but who I knew would be excited enough about the surprise to make the effort. I called him during his lunch break, away from the rest of the family. "Emma?" he answered, sounding genuinely surprised to hear from me on a Wednesday. "Everything okay?" "Everything's great," I assured him. "But I need your help with something. Top secret." I could practically hear him sitting up straighter, his interest piqued. Ryan, 2 years my junior at 24, had always loved anything that felt like an adventure or conspiracy. "I'm listening," he said, lowering his voice dramatically, even though he was likely alone. "I'm coming home to surprise everyone," I told him, feeling a flutter of excitement. "I'll be in Chicago for work next week, and I thought I'd fly home for the weekend before heading back to Seattle, but I don't want anyone to know." Ryan was silent for a beat too long. "You're coming home? For real?" "Just for the weekend," I clarified quickly. "I still have 2 weeks left in the fellowship after that." "Right, of course," he said, and I could hear the smile returning to his voice. "Sorry, it's just, it'll be really good to see you, Em." Something in his tone made me wonder if I'd been more missed than I realized. I pushed the thought aside, focusing on logistics. "So here's what I need from you," I continued. "Make sure everyone's home next Friday evening. Don't make it obvious. Maybe suggest a family dinner or movie night or something. I'll take an Uber from the airport and surprise everyone around 7. "Consider it done," Ryan agreed readily. "Mom and Dad don't go out much anyway, and I can make sure Melissa and Jake come over too." "Perfect," I said, already imagining their shocked faces. "And remember, not a word to anyone." "My lips are sealed," he promised solemnly. "Scout's honor." "You were kicked out of Scouts after 3 weeks," I reminded him, laughing. "That pine cone incident was blown way out of proportion," he protested, the familiar banter making me realize how much I missed him. "But seriously, Emma, I won't tell a soul." The Chicago assignment went better than expected. I interviewed key sources, gathered compelling material, and even had time to visit the Bean like a proper tourist. By the time I boarded my flight to Minneapolis Friday afternoon, I was riding high on professional success and anticipation for my surprise visit home. I texted Ryan from the Minneapolis airport. "Just landed. Everyone home?" His reply came quickly. "Operation Welcome Home is a go. Everyone here for family game night, ETA?" I smiled down at my phone. "About 30 mins. Don't blow my cover." The Uber driver was chatty in that uniquely Midwestern way that had once annoyed me. but now felt endearing after months in the more reserved Pacific Northwest. As we pulled onto my parents' street, my stomach fluttered with nerves and excitement. The maple trees lining the road were in full summer bloom, their leaves creating dappled shadows on the familiar houses. "Right here is perfect," I told the driver when we were still 2 houses away. I wanted to approach on foot, to have that moment of standing in the driveway and looking at my childhood home as both an insider and outsider. The evening was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze, the kind of Minnesota summer night that made you forget the brutal winters. I wheeled my small suitcase quietly up the driveway, noting Dad's meticulously maintained flower beds and the new wind chimes hanging from the front porch that I didn't recognize. Small changes that reminded me of life had continued in my absence. As I approached the house, I could see through the large living room window that my family was gathered around the coffee table. A board game was spread out, looked like Trivial Pursuit, Dad's favorite, and Melissa was gesturing animatedly about something while her husband, Jake, laughed. Ryan was checking his phone surreptitiously, looking for my updates, no doubt, while Mom returned from the kitchen with a bowl of something. Dad was in his usual armchair, looking exactly as he had when I left, right down to the Minnesota Twins cap on his head. The scene was so perfectly, achingly familiar that I stood frozen, for a moment just watching them. They looked happy, comfortable, complete. A strange thought flitted through my mind. Did they even notice the empty space where I should be sitting? I shook it off and continued toward the house, deciding to go around to the side door that led directly into the kitchen. It would allow me to slip in quietly and maximize the surprise factor. The side gate creaked exactly as it always had, Dad's perpetual promise to oil it now going on its 5th year, and I winced at the sound, hoping it wasn't audible from inside. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The kitchen window was cracked open to let in the summer breeze, and as I approached the side door, voices floated out clearly. "Ryan, put your phone away," Mom was saying. "Your turn to roll." "Sorry, just checking something for work," Ryan lied smoothly, and I smiled at his commitment to our surprise. "On a Friday night?" Melissa scoffed. "Some things never change. Always the worst at family game night etiquette." "Speaking of things never changing," Mom said, her voice taking on a wistful quality that made me pause with my hand on the door handle. "I got another one-line text from Emma today. 'Great week, super busy, love you all.'" That was it. My chest tightened. I hadn't realized my brief texts had become so predictable they were mockable. "She's building her career, Mom," Melissa said, always the defender despite our occasional sisterly spats. "That fellowship is a big deal." I know, Mom sighed. "I just miss her actual voice. Those Sunday calls used to be the highlight of my week." Guilt washed over me. I'd convinced myself they understood, that they supported my limited communication, because they knew how important this opportunity was. But hearing the hurt in Mom's voice made me realize I'd been selfish. "She's going to stay out there, isn't she?" Dad asked, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. The question everyone had apparently been thinking but not saying, aloud. There was a pause before Ryan spoke up. "Would that be so terrible?" His voice had a defensive edge that surprised me. "She's happy there." "Of course it wouldn't be terrible," Mom said quickly. "We want her to be happy. It's just that it's so far," Dad finished for her. "Seattle may as well be another country." "You guys managed when I moved to Chicago for 2 years," Melissa pointed out. "And now Jake and I are only across town." "That was different," Mom said. "You called every other day and you came home once a month." Another stab of guilt. Melissa had always been the responsible one, the one who did everything right. Of course she'd maintained perfect contact during her time away. "Look," Jake spoke up, his voice reasonable as always. Emma's finding her way. She's always been different from the rest of you. More independent, more restless. Restless is one word for it, Dad muttered, and I felt my face grow hot despite the evening coolness. Robert? Mom chided gently. What? I'm not criticizing, Dad defended himself. It's just a fact. That girl has always had one foot out the door, looking for the next big thing. Remember how many activities she signed up for in high school? Joined the newspaper, quit after 3 months. Debate team, quit. Photography club, quit that too. She stuck with soccer, Ryan pointed out. Only because she was naturally good at it, Melissa countered. Emma doesn't like to work at things that don't come easily. I stood frozen by the door, my surprise entrance forgotten as I listened to my family dissect my character flaws with such casual certainty. Had they always talked about me this way when I wasn't around? I just worry she's running toward something. That won't actually make her happy, Mom said softly. All that ambition, all that need to be somewhere else, do something bigger. Or maybe she's running away from something, Dad suggested. Away from what? Ryan asked. There was a pause, and I held my breath. Us, maybe, Dad said finally. This family, this life. That's not fair, Ryan protested, and I felt a surge of gratitude for my brother. Isn't it? Dad sighed heavily. When was the last time she seemed happy to be here, part of this family? Really present? No one answered immediately, which felt like an answer in itself. Can I just say something? Jake's voice broke the silence. As the in-law with some perspective? Please do, Mom encouraged. The house does feel different without Emma, he said carefully. More peaceful, Melissa finished for him and laughed lightly. Peaceful. The word echoed in my head, a perfect crystallization of what they all apparently felt about my absence. Melissa, Mom scolded, but there was a note of reluctant agreement in her voice that cut deeper than outright criticism would have. What? I love my sister, but you have to admit, there's less drama when she's not around, Melissa continued. No one walking in with a crisis every other day, no loud music, no friends showing up unannounced at dinner time, no emotional hurricanes sweeping through the living room. The house feels peaceful without her, Jake repeated, nodding thoughtfully. That's exactly it. Not better, just quieter, more predictable. I stood there, my hand still frozen on the door handle as silence fell inside. The surprise that had seemed so perfect, so cinematic in my imagination, now felt like a terrible mistake. I'd flown across the country only to discover that my absence had brought peace to my family home. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a text. From Ryan. Where are you? Getting hard to stall. I backed away from the door silently, wheeling my suitcase carefully over the uneven paving stones. At the gate, I hesitated, looking back at the warm glow of the kitchen window. For a moment, I considered still going through with it, walking in with a bright smile, pretending I hadn't heard anything. We'd hug, they'd exclaim in surprise, and for a few days I'd try to be less dramatic, less loud, less me. But something had shifted irreversibly. The family inside that house was having a perfectly lovely evening without the emotional hurricane that was Emma Taylor. And for the first time, I wondered if they were right about me. Had I been running away all along? Was Seattle just the key? Furthest place I could go without leaving the country entirely? My phone vibrated again with another text from Ryan. Everything okay? Should I create a distraction? I typed back quickly. Change of plans. Don't tell anyone I was here. Call you later. Before I could change my mind, I hurried back down the driveway, the wheels of my suitcase making too much noise on the concrete in the quiet evening. I reached the sidewalk and started walking, with no destination in mind other than away. After a block, my phone rang. Ryan. I declined the call and texted, Need time to think. Please don't say anything. 3 dots appeared immediately, disappeared, reappeared, then finally. Okay, but call me. Soon. The sun was beginning to set as I walked aimlessly through the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson's immaculate garden, the Palmer's basketball hoop where neighborhood kids still gathered on weekends, the corner where I'd crashed my bike and knocked out my front tooth in 2nd grade. Every landmark carried memories, each one now tinged with the uncomfortable. Question. Had I always been the disruption in an otherwise peaceful family? I found myself at Lakeside Park, where I'd spent countless summer evenings as a teenager escaping family dinners to meet friends. The old wooden bench overlooking the Gjöre, water still had initials carved into it. Some I recognized, others from a new generation of restless teenagers. I sat down heavily, the weight of what I'd overhead pressing on my chest. My phone buzzed with a notification from my rideshare app. The driver who'd dropped me off had found my laptop bag in the back seat. In my emotional state, I hadn't even noticed I'd left it. He offered to circle back to my home address to return it. I messaged him to meet me at the park instead, grateful for the excuse to stay away from the house a bit longer. While waiting, I opened my contacts and scrolled to Allison Walker, my old high school friend who'd stayed local and bought a house, just 10 minutes from our old neighborhood. We hadn't spoken in months, but she'd been the friend who always gave it to me straight. Emma Taylor? She answered on the 3rd ring, surprised but pleased. Tell me you're not just calling because you need something after ghosting me for half a year? The familiar teasing tone made me smile despite everything. Actually, I'm sitting on our old bench at Lakeside Park right now, I admitted, and I desperately need a place to crash tonight. There was a pause. You're in Minnesota. Right now? It's a long story. Well, lucky for you, Ben's away with his brothers for a fishing weekend, so I have the place to myself, Allison said, referring to her husband of 3 years. And I've got a bottle of wine that's begging to be opened. Give me 20 minutes. After retrieving my laptop from the driver, I sat watching the sunset reflect off the lake while waiting for Allison. Her silver Subaru pulled up exactly 18 minutes later. Allison had always been punctual to a fault. She stepped out, looking exactly as I remembered but with shorter hair framing her face. She'd always been the steady one in our friendship, practical, level-headed, reliable. Everything I apparently wasn't. Holy crap, it really is you, she said, pulling me into a tight hug. I half expected this to be some elaborate prank. As we embraced, the emotions I'd been holding back threatened to spill over. When we separated, she took one look at my face and her expression softened. Oh, what happened? I came to surprise my family, I explained, my voice cracking slightly. But before I could go in, I overheard them talking about how peaceful the house is without me. Allison winced. Ouch. Yeah. She helped me with my suitcase, and we drove to her house in a comfortable silence that only old friends can share. The suburban development where she and Ben had bought their first home was new. Rows of similar-looking houses with small but well-maintained yards. A far cry from the downtown Seattle apartment I'd been calling home. Inside, Allison's house was everything you'd expect from someone who had their life figured out at 26. Coordinated furniture, framed wedding photos, a spice rack with actual spices. She showed me to the guest room, an actual, dedicated guest room, not a multi-purpose storage space with an air mattress, and told me to get comfortable while she opened the wine. So, let me get this straight, Allison said later, as we sat on her back deck, each nursing a generous glass of Merlot. You flew from Chicago to surprise your family, but instead of going in, you eavesdropped and then ran away? Put that way, it sounded ridiculous. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. The window was open, and I was about to go in when I heard them talking. About me. And they said the house was peaceful without you? Allison confirmed, making air quotes around peaceful. I nodded, swirling the wine in my glass. Melissa said there's less drama when I'm not around. No emotional hurricanes sweeping through the living room. Well, she's not entirely wrong, Allison said with characteristic bluntness. When I looked up sharply, she shrugged unapologetically. Come on, Em. You've always been the most intense person in any room. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just who you are. Apparently, it's exhausting for everyone else, I muttered. Maybe, Allison conceded. But it's also what makes you Emma. Remember senior year when you convinced the principal to let us have prom at the art museum after the gym flooded? Or the time you organized that flash mob for Mrs. Grayson's retirement? That intensity gets things done. I smiled faintly at the memories. Those were a long time ago. My point is, your family probably does find it peaceful without you around stirring things up. And maybe a part of you enjoyed being away from what's the opposite of chaos? Their excessive normalcy. The observation hit uncomfortably, close to home. I had enjoyed the freedom of Seattle, away from the expectations and routines of the Taylor household. So, what now? Allison prompted, when I didn't respond. Are you going to let them know you're here? Or slink back to Seattle with your tail between your legs? I grimaced at her characterization. I don't know. I'm supposed to fly back tomorrow night. I could just not tell them I was ever here. Allison topped off our glasses. That sounds like running away. Isn't that what they think I've been doing all along? Running away from them? Have you been? She challenged me. The question hung in the night air between us. Had I? Was my ambition, my restlessness, my desire for something more, just an elaborate escape plan from a family I never quite fit into? I don't think I have been, I said slowly. At least, not consciously. I genuinely love the work I'm doing in Seattle. The fellowship has been everything I hoped for professionally. But hearing them talk about me like that, like my absence has made their lives better, makes me wonder if I've been the problem all along. Allison leaned forward, fixing me with the direct stare that had intimidated many over the years. Or maybe you're just different from them. Maybe your energy is too big for that house, and that's okay. Not fitting perfectly with your family doesn't make you wrong, Emma. My phone buzzed with another text from Ryan. Seriously worried. Call me. I showed the phone to Allison, who raised an eyebrow. At least tell your brother you're okay. The poor guy must be going out of his mind. She was right. I stepped away to call Ryan, who answered immediately. Emma? Where are you? Are you okay? I'm fine, I assured him. I'm staying with Allison Walker. Remember her from high school? Yeah, but what happened? Why didn't you come in? I hesitated. I overheard everyone talking through the kitchen window about how peaceful the house is without me. Ryan was silent for a beat. Oh, shit. Yeah. Look, it wasn't like that. Not really, he began awkwardly. They were just… Don't, I cut him off. I heard it clearly, and it's fine. Maybe they're right. They're not, Ryan insisted. Should I tell them you're in town? Mom would be crushed if she knew you came all this way and didn't even come in. No, I said firmly. I need to figure some things out first. Just cover for me if they ask why you're being weird. After extracting a reluctant promise from Ryan to keep my secret, I rejoined Allison on the deck. Family drama averted for now? She asked. Temporarily, I agreed. So, here's what I think, Allison said, setting down her wine glass decisively. You have two choices. You can go back to Seattle tomorrow without ever letting your family know you were here, which is the coward's way out. Harsh, I interrupted. Or, she continued, ignoring me. You can face them. Tell them what you heard, how it made you feel, and have an actual adult conversation about it. Your choice. Put that way, there really wasn't a choice at all. Running away would only confirm what they already thought about me. What would I even say? I wondered aloud. Hey, surprise! I came home to visit, but then I heard you all saying how much better your lives are without me, so I ran away to lick my wounds. That's a start, Allison nodded, though maybe with less self-pity. I threw a decorative pillow at her, which she dodged easily. What if they're right? I asked, voicing my deepest fear. What if I am just a tornado that disrupts everyone's lives? Allison considered this. What if you are? Some people are tornadoes, Emma. They shake things up, force change, make people see things differently. Would you really want to be any other way? I thought about my colleagues in Seattle, how they valued my fresh perspective and energetic approach. My editor had specifically mentioned my ability to shake up the status quo in my last performance review. I guess not, I admitted. But I also don't want to make my family miserable just by being myself. Then maybe the answer isn't changing who you are, but finding a balance, Allison suggested. Being a slightly more contained tornado around them, if that's what makes visits home more enjoyable for everyone. We stayed up late into the night, reminiscing about high school adventures and catching up on the past 6 months. Allison showed me wedding photos of mutual friends I'd lost touch with, talked about her plans to start trying for a baby next year, and filled me in on neighborhood gossip. It felt comfortingly normal, this glimpse into the life I might have had if I'd stayed. The next morning over coffee, Allison asked the question I'd been avoiding. So, what's the plan? Your flight back to Seattle is tonight, right? I nodded, staring into my mug. I think I need to talk to them before I go. You're right. Running away would just prove them right about me. Want moral support? She offered. I could drive you over. I shook my head. This is something I need to do alone. After borrowing Allison's car, I drove slowly through the familiar streets, rehearsing what I would say. None of the opening lines I came up with seemed right. How do you start a conversation about accidentally overhearing your family's relief at your absence? As I pulled into the driveway, my heart hammered in my chest. I'd texted Ryan to make sure. Everyone would be home for Sunday brunch, a Taylor family tradition I'd missed participating in for the past 6 months. He'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji and good luck. The side gate still creaked as I pushed it open, and I made no effort to silence it this time. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the side door rather than using my key. This no longer felt like my home to walk into unannounced. My mother opened the door, a dish towel in hand, and froze mid-greeting when she saw me. Emma? Surprise, I said weakly, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Emma, she repeated, louder this time, genuine shock and joy flooding her face as she pulled me into a tight hug that smelled of cinnamon and the lavender laundry detergent she'd used my entire life. The commotion brought everyone running, Dad from the backyard, Ryan pretending to be surprised, Melissa and Jake from the dining room. There were exclamations, more hugs, rapid-fire questions about what I was doing there, how long I could stay, why I hadn't told them I was coming. I wanted to surprise you, I said, the half-truth sticking in my throat. I was in Chicago for work and thought I'd stop by before heading back tonight. Tonight? Mom repeated, dismay evident in her voice. That's so short. Why didn't you call? Dad asked, his joy tempered with practical concerns as always. We would have picked you up from the airport. That would have ruined the surprise, I pointed out, trying to keep my tone light despite the heaviness in my chest. They ushered me into the familiar chaos of Sunday brunch, pancakes sizzling on the griddle, coffee brewing, the dining table already set with the mismatched plates that Mom refused to replace because each had been handed down from some relative or another. You're just in time, Mom said, bustling around the kitchen with renewed energy. Ryan, get another place setting. Jake, can you grab the extra chair from the office? Everyone scattered to accommodate my unexpected presence, and for a moment, I stood alone in the center of the kitchen, watching the familiar choreography of my family adjusting their routine. Just like that, the peaceful Sunday morning had been disrupted by me. As we sat down to eat, the conversation flowed around me. Updates on neighborhood news, Melissa and Jake's plans to look at houses in a better school district for the future, Ryan's promotion at work. I answered questions about Seattle on autopilot, sharing sanitized versions of fellowship stories, nodding and smiling at all the right moments. But beneath the surface normality, tension thrummed through my body. Every laugh felt forced, every response calculated. I was hyper-aware of taking up space, of the volume of my voice, of how often I spoke. I found myself unconsciously shrinking, letting others talk over me, swallowing comments and questions. Ryan kept shooting me concerned glances, clearly noticing my subdued behavior. Mom, too, seemed to sense something was off, refilling my coffee cup with extra attentiveness and touching my shoulder whenever she passed behind my chair. Finally, as brunch wound down and Dad started gathering dishes, I knew it was time. I couldn't leave again with this weight between us. Actually, I said, my voice cracking slightly, there's something I need to tell you all. The table fell silent, 5 faces turning toward me with various expressions of curiosity and concern. I was here last night, I blurted out, the words tumbling free before I could reconsider. I came to surprise you, but before I could come in, I overheard you all talking. Through the kitchen window. Confusion gave way to dawning horror on my parents' faces as they realized what I must have heard. Ryan looked down at his plate, while Melissa and Jake exchanged an uncomfortable glance. Emma, honey? Mom began, but I held up a hand. I heard what you said about the house being peaceful without me, I continued, determined to get through this. About me being an emotional hurricane. About me always running away. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad had frozen in the act of stacking plates, now standing uncomfortably beside the table. Where did you go? Mom finally asked, her voice small. If you were here last night, where did you sleep? At Allison Walker's, I answered. I needed time to think. You should have come in, Dad said gruffly, setting the dishes down with a clatter, rather than eavesdropping and running off. Robert? Mom chided. No, he's right, I acknowledged. I should have. But hearing those things, I swallowed hard. It hurt. We didn't mean to hurt you, Melissa said, looking genuinely distressed. We were just talking. About how much better your lives are without me around, I finished for her? That's not what we said, Jake interjected gently. You said the house was peaceful without me, I countered. That there's less drama when I'm not here. And that's true, Melissa said, never one to back down from uncomfortable truths. But different doesn't mean better. Melissa, Mom warned. No. Mom, she needs to hear this, Melissa insisted. Yes, Emma, you're loud and dramatic, and you take up a lot of space. You always have been. And yes, the house is quieter when you're not here, but it's also less interesting, less vibrant. I blinked, taken aback by her words. What your sister is trying to say, Dad picked up, is that we miss you, even the chaos you bring. Then why did it sound like you were all relieved I was gone? I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Mom reached across the table to take my hand. Oh, sweetie, we were just adjusting. Every family has a different dynamic when someone leaves. It takes time to find a new normal. But that doesn't mean we prefer you gone. I heard what I heard, I insisted stubbornly. You heard a moment in time, Ryan finally spoke up. A conversation where everyone was missing you but trying to find the silver lining. That's all. I looked around the table at their earnest faces, wanting desperately to believe them. But the words I'd overheard still echoed in my mind. I've been offered a permanent position in Seattle, I said suddenly. After the fellowship ends, I've been trying to decide whether to take it. The announcement landed heavily in the room. Mom's hand tightened around mine. And now you think we want you to take it? Dad surmised, his perception uncomfortably accurate, as always. Because we said the house is peaceful without you, I nodded, unable to find the words. That couldn't be further from the truth, Mom said firmly. We want you to take it if it makes you happy, Emma. Not because you think we don't. Want you here. The truth is, Dad added, his voice gruff with emotion, this house has felt too damn peaceful without you, like something important is missing. Something in his tone, in the way his eyes glistened slightly, broke through the protective shell. I'd built around myself since overhearing their conversation. For the first time since arriving, I felt tears threatening. I don't want to be someone who makes everyone uncomfortable just by being myself, I admitted, the fear I'd been carrying finally spoken aloud. You don't, Ryan insisted. You make. Things happen. You always have. Remember when Grandma was in the hospital and the nurses said only 2 visitors at once? You somehow convinced them to let all 5 of us in. Or when the lease on your first apartment fell through, Melissa added, and you managed to find a new place and move all your stuff in a single weekend. Your energy is a gift, Emma, Mom said quietly. Even when it's exhausting. Sometimes, especially when it's exhausting, Dad agreed with a chuckle. I looked around at my family, at the love in their faces, the genuine desire to make me understand my place among them. Maybe Allison was right. Maybe it wasn't about changing who I was, but finding a balance. So if I take the job in Seattle, I began tentatively. We'll be incredibly proud, Mom finished for me, and we'll expect more than one-line texts and missed Sunday calls. And visits home more than once every 6 months, Dad added. And maybe the occasional video call so we can actually see your face, Ryan chimed in. I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen, a knot of insecurity and doubt that had been growing since I left home 6 months ago, or maybe long before that. I can do that, I promised, a tentative smile forming. And maybe I can try to be less of a tornado when I visit. Don't you dare, Melissa said with surprising vehemence. We need a good shake-up around here once in a while. As laughter rippled around the table, I realized that perhaps I'd misunderstood everything. Not just the conversation I'd overheard, but my place in this family. Yes, I disrupted their peace. I brought chaos into their ordered lives. But maybe that wasn't something to fix or apologize for. Maybe it was exactly what made me essential. The hours after our family conversation passed in a strange blur of normalcy and newness. Mom insisted I help her in the garden, just like old times. Though we both knew I'd never been much of a gardener. I'd always been too impatient for the slow, methodical work of weeding and pruning, preferring activities with immediate results. But today, kneeling beside her in the warm Minnesota sunshine, there was something soothing about the rhythmic pulling of weeds, the quiet companionship. Remember when you tried to speed up the growth of those sunflower seeds for your science project? Mom asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I groaned at the memory. I was convinced that if I watered them every hour and gave them encouraging pep talks, they'd grow faster. You killed 3 batches before you finally listened to me about overwatering, she laughed. I've never been good at waiting, I admitted, sitting back on my heels and wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. Mom paused her work, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. No, you haven't. But that's not always a bad thing. Your father would still be thinking about replacing that back fence if you hadn't taken matters into your own hands last summer. You mean if I hadn't ordered the materials without telling him and then guilted him into helping me? Put it up that weekend? Exactly, she nodded, returning to her weeding with a satisfied smile. The conversation with Mom was the first of many throughout that day, small moments of connection that felt different somehow, more honest, as if the painful words I'd overheard and the subsequent confrontation had cleared away a fog between us. Dad corralled me into helping him organize his tool shed, a project I'd been avoiding for years. As we sorted through rusted wrenches and half-empty paint cans, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "That supervisor of yours," he began, not looking at me. "The one who hinted about the permanent position. He sounds like he recognizes talent when he sees it." Coming from my father, this was high praise indeed. "She," I corrected gently. "Catherine Fleming. And yes, she's been an incredible mentor." Dad nodded, accepting the correction without comment. "You think you'll take it? The permanent job?" I hesitated, arranging a set of screwdrivers by size to buy myself time. "I'm still deciding. It's an amazing opportunity professionally, but it's so far from home." "Distance works both ways, you know," Dad said, his focus seemingly entirely on labeling a box of electrical supplies. "Planes fly from Minneapolis to Seattle just as easily as they fly from Seattle to Minneapolis." I looked up, surprised by the implication. "Are you saying you and Mom would visit?" "We're not ancient, Emma," he replied with a hint of indignation. "We can still travel. Your mother's been dropping hints about seeing the Space Needle for years." He paused, then added more softly, "Sometimes I think we've held you kids too close. Especially you." "What do you mean?" Dad sighed, finally looking up from his task. Melissa was always going to chart her own course, and Ryan, well, Ryan's content right where he is. "But you've always had bigger dreams, Emma. Dreams that scared us a little." "Scared you?" I echoed, puzzled. My practical, unflappable. Father had never seemed scared of anything. "We were afraid you'd go too far, find something better and never look back." Dad's admission was matter of fact, but I could see the vulnerability behind it. "Maybe we held on too tight because of that fear. Made you feel like you had to choose between your dreams and your family." The realization hit me with unexpected force. All this time, I'd thought they didn't understand my ambition, my need to explore beyond the boundaries of our suburban Minneapolis life. I never considered they might have understood it all too well, and that their occasional resistance came from fear of losing me completely. "I would never not come back," I said quietly. "I know that now," Dad replied, returning to his organizing, with renewed focus. "Just don't forget to call your mother more often than you have been. She worries." By late afternoon, my flight back to Seattle was looming. Ryan offered to drive me to the airport, an opportunity for one final conversation, before I left. As we pulled onto the highway, I glanced over at my brother, struck by how adult he looked behind the wheel. When had that happen? In my mind, he was perpetually 19, gangly and a bit awkward. The confident man beside me was a stranger in many ways. One more chance I'd missed by being away. "Thanks for not ratting me out," I said, breaking the companionable silence between us. "About last night?" Ryan shrugged. "That's what brothers are for, covering up their sister's emotional crises." "Is that in the official brother handbook?" I teased. Chapter 3. Right after How to Scare Away Potential Boyfriends and before eating the last slice of pizza without getting caught. We shared a laugh, but it faded into another silence, this one heavier with unspoken questions. "They really do miss you," Ryan finally said. "We all do." "I know that now," I acknowledged. I didn't expect to hear what I heard." "Would you have preferred they were miserable without you?" Ryan asked, shooting me a quick skeptical glance. "Because that's kind of messed up, Emma." "No, of course not," I protested. Then, more honestly, maybe a little. Not miserable exactly, but incomplete. Like there was an Emma-shaped hole in the family that couldn't be filled. Ryan snorted. "There is, but that doesn't mean we sit around in constant despair. Life goes on. We adjust. Doesn't mean we like it better." His straightforward assessment was refreshing after the emotional intensity of the day. "When did you get so wise?" I asked, only half joking. "Probably around the time you stopped paying attention," he replied, but his smile took the sting out of the words. Look, take the job in Seattle if it's what you want. Just don't make yourself a stranger, okay? I promised I wouldn't, and we spent the rest of the drive talking about lighter topics. Ryan's new girlfriend, Tara, whom I'd yet to meet. The twins' disappointing season. The ridiculous new hairstyle Mr. Wilson across the street was sporting. Normal sibling chat that felt precious now, knowing how rare our in-person conversations would be if I stayed in Seattle. At the airport, Ryan hugged me tightly before I could exit the car. "Just so you know," he mumbled into my hair, "I like having a sister who's an emotional hurricane. Makes my life way more interesting." I blinked back unexpected tears as I pulled away. Thanks, Rye. The flight back to Seattle was a blur of turbulence and half-formed thoughts. I pulled out my laptop, intending to work on an article due the following week, but found myself staring at a blank document instead, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours. Had it really been just yesterday that I'd stood outside my childhood home, devastated by the words I'd overheard? The emotional whiplash was disorienting. I'd gone from feeling like an unwelcome disruption to understanding that my family valued me because of my energy, not in spite of it. Yet the fact remained that they'd found peace in my absence, even if they missed me simultaneously. Was it possible for both things to be true? By the time the plane touched down in Seattle, the city lights twinkling below in the evening darkness, I'd reached no definitive conclusions about the job offer or my place in my family's ecosystem. But I felt lighter somehow, as if naming the tensions had diminished their power. My Seattle apartment welcomed me with the impersonal emptiness that had never bothered me before. 6 months in, it still looked barely lived in. No photos on the ER's walls, no accumulated knickknacks. Nothing that said Emma lives here beyond the basic necessities and a few scattered books. I'd told myself I was being minimalist, but standing in the quiet space after the cluttered warmth of my childhood home, I wondered if I'd been afraid to put down roots. The next morning, I arrived at the fellowship office earlier than usual, hoping to catch Catherine before the day's chaos began. Her corner office overlooked Elliott Bay, the early light glinting off the water and illuminating the space in a way that always made her look slightly ethereal, an effect I suspected she'd calculated when selecting the office. "Emma," she greeted me with genuine warmth, looking up from her computer. "How was Chicago? Did you get everything you needed for the piece?" The Chicago trip was productive, I confirmed, settling into the chair across from her desk. But actually, I took a detour to Minneapolis afterward, to visit my family. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. This was the most personal information I'd volunteered in our 6 months working together. I'd kept our conversations strictly professional, eager to be seen as dedicated and serious about my career. "A surprise visit?" she guessed, with the uncanny perception that made her such a formidable editor. "How did you know?" she smiled. "Just a hunch. How did it go?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share with my professional mentor. But something about Catherine's direct gaze encouraged honesty. "It was illuminating," I settled on. "I overheard some things I wasn't meant to hear." Catherine leaned back in her chair, giving me her full attention. "That sounds ominous." "They said the house was peaceful without me," I admitted, the words still carrying a sting despite the subsequent conversations. "That I'm essentially a human tornado disrupting everyone's lives." To my surprise, Catherine laughed, a quick, delighted sound she immediately tried to suppress when she saw my expression. "I'm sorry," she said, composing herself. "It's just, that's exactly how I described you to the hiring committee when I recommended you for this fellowship." "You what?" I asked, stunned. "Not those exact words," she clarified. "I said you were a force of nature, someone who shakes up stagnant thinking, who asks the questions no one else thinks to ask. It's why you've been so valuable here." I sat back, processing this unexpected perspective. "So, is my disruptive energy professionally advantageous?" "In the right environment, absolutely," Catherine nodded. Every news organization needs people who stir things up, who refuse to accept, "That's how we've always done it," as an answer. The trick is channeling that energy productively. She studied me thoughtfully. "I'm guessing your family eventually admitted they miss your hurricane tendencies?" "They did," I acknowledged, impressed again by her insight, though they also appreciate the occasional calm. "As do we all," Catherine agreed with a wry smile. "Listen, Emma, I've been meaning to have a formal conversation with you about the permanent position. Based on your work these past 6 months, we'd like to offer you a full-time role as a feature writer, with the potential to develop your own recurring column within a year if things go well." She slid a folder across the desk, the official offer letter with details about salary, benefits, and job expectations. "You don't have to decide immediately," she continued. "Take a week to think it over. But I want you to know that we value precisely the qualities that might occasionally overwhelm your family. Your intensity, your passion, your refusal to settle for easy answers. Those aren't liabilities here, Emma. They're assets." I thanked her, tucking the folder into my bag with hands that trembled slightly. Outside her office, I found a quiet corner of the shared workspace and called my mother, something I hadn't done spontaneously in months. "Emma?" she answered, surprise evident in her voice at the unexpected weekday call. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I assured her. "I just got the official job offer from the paper. Catherine, my supervisor, just gave it to me." "Oh, honey, that's wonderful." Mom's genuine enthusiasm warmed me even from thousands of miles away. "Have you decided what you'll do?" "Not yet," I admitted. "It's a great opportunity, but it's far from home," she finished for me. "I understand. But remember what we talked about yesterday. Taking this job doesn't mean choosing between your career and your family. It just means we all have to work a little harder at staying connected." "Weekly calls instead of occasional texts?" I suggested, smiling despite the faint ache in my chest. "And visits more than twice a year," Mom added. "Your father was serious about wanting to see the Space Needle, you know." After we hung up, I spent the morning going through the motions of my regular work routine, but my mind was elsewhere. Caught between Minneapolis and Seattle, between the comfort of family and the exhilaration of building something entirely my own. At lunch, I escaped to a small park near the office building, finding a bench where I could watch the ferry boats crossing. The sound. The Seattle landscape still felt novel in many ways. The mountains visible on clear days, the constant presence of water, the particular quality of light filtering through near constant cloud cover. So different from the wide Midwestern skies I'd grown up under. My phone buzzed with a text from Allison. "So, are you taking the job or what?" I smiled at her characteristic directness. "Still deciding." "Thanks for the emergency crash space and therapy session. That's what friends are for," she replied immediately. "But for the record, you've always been too big for Minneapolis. Some people are meant to roam." Her words echoed what I'd been feeling, but hadn't fully articulated. Was that what my restlessness had always been about? Not running away from my family, but running toward the person I could only become by leaving? That evening, I wandered my sparse apartment with new eyes, seeing not minimalism but impermanence in the lack of personal touches. On impulse, I dug through my suitcase and found the small photo I'd carried with me to Seattle but never displayed. My family at Melissa's wedding 3 years ago. All of us laughing at something Dad had said just as the photographer captured the moment. I propped it on my bedside table, a small acknowledgement that carrying my family with me didn't have to mean physically staying close to them. The next morning, I arrived at Catherine's office before she did. The signed acceptance letter in hand. "You're sure?" she asked when she found me waiting. "You don't want to take more time to consider it?" "I'm sure," I confirmed. "But I have one request." Catherine raised an eyebrow expectantly. "I'd like to work remotely for 2 weeks around the Yucca holidays. I said. And maybe a week in the summer, to spend time with my family in Minneapolis. I think we can accommodate that, Catherine agreed, looking pleased. Welcome officially to the team, Emma. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into establishing a new normal, one that honored both my ambitions and my family connections. I scheduled regular video calls with my parents, sent actual physical letters to Ryan occasionally, which he found hilarious and endearing in equal measure, and even managed a long-distance movie night with Melissa and Jake, streaming the same film simultaneously while texting running commentary. I also began the process of making my Seattle apartment feel like home. I hung art on the walls, bought plants I hoped not to kill, and invited colleagues over for dinner, slowly building a community that could never replace my family but might someday feel like a second home. 3 months after my fateful trip to Minneapolis, Dad and Mom made good on their promise to visit. I spent days anxiously cleaning my apartment, planning outings, and worrying about whether they'd think I'd made the right choice. When they finally arrived, Mom immediately began rearranging my kitchen cabinets for better flow, while Dad examined my building's maintenance systems with professional interest. Within hours, it was clear they'd brought their own particular brand of Taylor family chaos to my carefully curated Seattle life, and I couldn't have been happier about it. On their second night, as we shared takeout from my favorite local Thai restaurant, Dad cleared his throat in the way that always signaled he had something important to say. "Your mother and I have been thinking," he began, exchanging a look with Mom that I couldn't interpret. "The house is too big for just the two of us, especially with you kids gone most of the time." My heart sank. Were they selling the family home? The thought of strangers living in the house where I'd grown up sent a pang of unexpected grief through me. "We're not getting any younger," Mom picked up the thread. "And while the house does feel peaceful sometimes without you kids around..." "Too peaceful," Dad interjected gruffly. "Exactly," Mom nodded. "Too peaceful. So we've decided to look into buying a small vacation property." I blinked, confused by this turn in the conversation. "A vacation property? Where?" Dad took a sudden intense interest in his pad thai. "We were thinking somewhere on the Washington coast, maybe a couple hours from Seattle." The implication hit me all at once. "You want a place near me?" "Not too near," Mom clarified hastily. "We'd only visit occasionally. We don't want to cramp your style." "But near enough that we could see you more than twice a year," Dad added. "If you wanted that." The lump in my throat made it difficult to respond immediately. My parents, who had rarely traveled outside Minnesota and neighboring states, were considering buying property near Seattle, not to monitor me or pressure me to come home, but to build a new kind of connection that honored both my independence and our family bonds. "I'd like that," I managed finally. "I'd like that a lot." "Good." Dad nodded decisively, as if the matter was settled. "Because your mother's already scheduled 4 property viewings for tomorrow." "Robert," Mom protested. "We agreed to bring it up casually first." "This is me being casual," Dad insisted, the twinkle in his eye giving him away. As they playfully bickered across my kitchen table, I felt the final pieces of my internal conflict settling into place. The house in Minneapolis might be more peaceful without me, and my Seattle life might be more independent without them, but neither was complete on its own. Perhaps that was the lesson I'd needed all along, that growing up and finding my own path didn't mean choosing between who I was and who I wanted to become. It meant building a life expansive enough to hold both my hurricane nature and my family's quieter rhythms, my Seattle ambitions, and my Minneapolis roots. The distance between the two would never disappear entirely. But maybe, just maybe, it could become a bridge rather than a barrier, a space where all of us could meet in the middle, changed but still connected by the unmistakable, unbreakable bonds of family. 6 months into my permanent position at the Seattle newspaper, I'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost natural. My byline appeared regularly on feature stories. I developed a small but dedicated readership for my weekly column on urban community initiatives, and I'd even been nominated for a regional journalism award for a series on affordable housing solutions. Professionally, everything was clicking into place. The hurricane energy that had sometimes felt like a liability in my family. Home had become my signature as a journalist. Catherine encouraged my tendency to ask uncomfortable questions, to push past surface-level answers, to dig deeper where others might settle for the obvious story. "You've got good instincts," she told me during a quarterly review meeting. You see connections others miss. Personal life, however, was more complicated. I'd made friends, colleagues from work, neighbors in my apartment building, even a few regulars from my favorite coffee shop. But Seattle still didn't feel like home in the bone-deep way that Minneapolis always had, despite my restlessness. There. My parents had followed through on their spontaneous plan. After viewing several properties during their visit, they settled on a modest cabin about 2 hours from Seattle, in a small coastal town with views of the Pacific. It needed work. Dad's eyes had lit up with renovation possibilities the moment the real estate agent opened the front door. But the bones were good, and the price was reasonable for a second property. The closing date was set for next month, and they'd already started planning a summer stay to begin renovations. Mom had sent me dozens of paint swatches via text message, seeking my opinion on everything from kitchen cabinets to bathroom tiles. "We want it to feel like your space, too," she'd explained during one of our weekly video calls. "Somewhere you can escape the city when you need a break." The thoughtfulness of the gesture still overwhelmed me sometimes. My parents, who had rarely ventured far from their comfort zone, were creating a bridge between our worlds, a physical manifestation of our commitment to staying connected despite the distance. On a rainy Tuesday morning in February, my phone rang with Ryan's number, unusual since he typically texted rather than called, especially during work hours. "Ryan, everything okay?" I answered, immediately concerned. "Define okay," he replied, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Physically, everyone's fine, but there's been a situation." I stepped away from my desk, moving to a quiet corner of the office. "What kind of situation?" "Dad's company is downsizing. His department got hit hard. He's been offered early retirement." The news hit me harder than expected. Dad had worked for the same engineering firm for over 30 years. His identity was thoroughly intertwined with his professional role, the steady, reliable Robert Taylor who solved problems and mentored younger engineers. "Early retirement," I repeated. "Is that good or bad news? Did he want to retire?" "Not for another 5 years at least," Ryan sighed. "He's only 58, Em. The package is decent financially, but you know Dad. It's who he is." I did know. Dad had always defined himself through his professional accomplishments, through being needed and respected in his field. The prospect of an unplanned, premature end to that chapter would be devastating to him. "How's he taking it?" "Exactly how you'd expect," Ryan replied grimly. "Says it's fine and probably for the best, while spending 18 hours a day in his workshop building things nobody needs. And Mom? Worried sick but pretending not to be. She asked me not to tell you. Said you have enough on your plate with your career taking off." The familiar guilt surfaced again. Even now, my family was trying to protect me, to avoid disrupting my Seattle life with their problems, as if I were too fragile or self-absorbed to handle family difficulties from a distance. "I'm coming home," I decided aloud. "I have some vacation days saved up. I can be there by tomorrow." "Are you sure?" Ryan asked. "Mom will kill me if she thinks I guilted you into coming." "You didn't. This is my decision." I was already mentally calculating what I needed to rearrange, which deadlines could be met remotely, what stories might need to be reassigned. "Just don't tell them I'm coming." A beat of silence, then Ryan's cautious voice. The last surprise visit didn't go so well, if you recall. This is different, I insisted. Besides, I learned my lesson about eavesdropping. After hanging up, I marched directly to Catherine's office, preparing my case for an unexpected week off. To my surprise, she didn't push back at all. "Family comes first," she said simply. "The newspaper survived before you joined us, and it will manage a week without you now. Just file your column remotely if you can." 24 hours later, I was once again standing in my parents' driveway, this time with advance notice to at least one family member. Ryan had confirmed everyone would be home for a family dinner he'd organized as a pretense, though this time I planned to actually enter the house rather than lurking outside. The February Minnesota evening was bitterly cold, a stark contrast to Seattle's milder but rainier winter. My breath formed clouds in the frigid air as I approached the front door, luggage in tow. This time I rang the doorbell like a proper visitor. Mom answered, her surprised expression quickly transforming into tearful joy. "Emma, what are you doing here?" "Surprise," I said, smiling as she pulled me into a fierce hug. "I thought a family dinner might need all family members present." She drew back, suddenly suspicious. "Ryan told you, didn't he?" "Told me what?" I feigned innocence poorly. Over Mom's shoulder, I could see Dad emerging from the hallway, his expression shifting from curiosity to a complicated mix of happiness and something else. Embarrassment, perhaps. The news about his job situation had clearly hit him hard. He looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered from just a few months ago. "The prodigal daughter returns," he said, his attempt at lightness falling slightly flat. "What brings you back to the frozen tundra?" "I missed you guys," I answered simply, stepping inside and closing the door against the cold. "And I had some vacation time to use. Thought I'd surprise you." "Well, you certainly succeeded there," Mom said, already taking my coat and fussing over whether I was hungry or tired from the flight. Ryan appeared from the kitchen, giving me a quick wink behind our parents' backs. What a coincidence that Emma showed up for the family dinner I planned, almost like someone told her about it. "Subtle, Ryan," I muttered as I passed him, bumping his shoulder with mine in familiar sibling communication. Dinner was a study in careful conversation. Mom and Ryan maintained a stream of cheerful updates and questions about Seattle, while Dad contributed occasional comments or questions, his usual energy noticeably dimmed. I played along, aware that confronting the elephant in the room would need to happen organically rather than being forced. It wasn't until after dinner, when Mom and Ryan were clearing dishes in the kitchen, that I found my opportunity. Dad had retreated to his armchair with a technical journal, his standard evening routine, though I noticed he'd been on the same page for 20 minutes. I settled on the couch across from him. "So," I began casually, "Ryan mentioned there have been some changes at work." Dad's posture stiffened slightly, but he didn't look up from his journal. "Ryan talks too much. He's worried about you. We all are." "Nothing to worry about. These things happen. Companies restructure." His tone aimed for matter of fact, but landed somewhere closer to defeated. 32 years of service, and it comes down to a manila envelope with retirement papers. The bitterness in his voice was so uncharacteristic of my stoic father that it caught me off guard. Dad had always been the family rock, the one who weathered crises with calm pragmatism. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said softly. "It's completely unfair." He finally looked up, his expression vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. "You know what the worst part is? The relief I saw in some of the younger engineers' faces when they realized they were safe, and I was the one getting cut. As if I was obsolete." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. My father, who had always defined himself by being needed, by having answers, by mentoring others, was facing his professional mortality, and it had shaken him to his core. You know that's not true, I said firmly. Your value isn't determined by some corporate cost-cutting measure. Isn't it? He challenged, uncharacteristically direct. When you were little, I could fix anything. Broken toys, scraped knees, math, homework. Now I can't even fix my own career. I wasn't used to this role reversal, being the one offering wisdom to my father rather than receiving it. But perhaps this was part of growing up, of the shifting dynamics between adult children and their parents. I've been thinking about something you told me, I said, choosing my words carefully. When I was worried about disrupting everyone's lives by being too intense, too much of a hurricane, you said that energy was a gift, even when it was exhausting. Dad's expression softened slightly at the memory. Your experience is a gift too, Dad, I continued. Maybe not to the short-sighted company that let you go, but to someone. The question isn't whether you still have value, that's absolute. The question is where to direct that value next. Before he could respond, Mom appeared from the kitchen with coffee, her timing either coincidental or calculated to interrupt what she perceived as a difficult conversation. But a look passed between my father and me, an acknowledgement that something important had been said, even if we weren't ready to fully explore it yet. The next morning, I woke early, jet lag and the time difference making 5 a.m. feel later than it was. I made my way quietly downstairs, surprised to find Mom already in the kitchen, staring thoughtfully into a cup of tea. "You're up early," she commented as I joined her at the table. "So are you," I countered, helping myself to tea from the pot she'd made. "I don't sleep well these days," she admitted with a small shrug. "Too much on my mind?" We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the winter darkness outside gradually lighten to gray dawn. "I wish you'd told me about Dad," I said finally. "I had to hear it from Ryan. Why didn't you want me to know?" Mom sighed, cradling her mug. "You've worked so hard for this career, Emma. You're finally finding your footing in Seattle. The last thing you need is to be worrying about problems back home. But that's exactly what I need," I insisted. "You guys are still my family, regardless of geography. I want to know when important things happen, good or bad. She hesitated. "We don't want to be the reason you feel pulled back. After everything we talked about, your place in the family, finding your own path, it felt wrong to burden you with this." "It's not a burden if I choose it," I said firmly. "That's the difference. I'm not here because I feel obligated. I'm here because I want to be, because Dad needs support right now, and because I can offer perspective that might help." Mom studied me over the rim of her mug, a new awareness in her gaze. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers." I smiled. "So, tell me honestly, how bad is it? Financially, emotionally, all of it." She set down her cup with a sigh that seemed to come from deep within. "Financially, we'll be okay. The retirement package is decent, and we've saved well. It's the emotional toll that concerns me. Your father has been," she searched for the right word, "lost, rudderless. His identity was so tied to that job." "What about the coastal property?" I asked. "Is that still happening?" "We've discussed putting it on hold," Mom admitted. "With the uncertainty—" "No," I interrupted firmly. "That's exactly the wrong approach. Dad needs a project, a purpose. The renovation would be perfect." Mom looked skeptical. "We can't just move to Washington permanently, Emma. Our lives are here." "Not permanently," I clarified. "But maybe longer than the few weeks you initially planned. 3 months, even 6. Time for Dad to reset, to think about what comes next, without the daily reminder of what he's lost. And the renovation work would keep his mind and hands busy." The idea took root as I spoke it aloud. Dad needed distance from the community where everyone knew him as Robert Taylor from Wilson Engineering. He needed space to reimagine himself without the constant reminders of his former professional identity. Mom was quiet, considering. It's not a terrible idea, she conceded finally. But what about Ryan? Melissa? Our friends here? They'll understand. And Seattle has airports too, you know. They can visit. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Using my own arguments against me, I see. I learned from the best, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. By the time Dad and Ryan came downstairs, Mom and I had outlined a tentative plan, extending the coastal property stay from a few weeks to 3 months initially, with the option to extend further. Dad would have the renovation project to focus on, and the change of scenery might provide perspective on what he wanted his next chapter to look like. Presenting the idea to Dad was another matter. His initial reaction was predictably resistant. Run. Away to Washington? He scoffed over breakfast. Hide from my problems on the other side of the country. That's not how I operate. It's not running away, I countered. It's strategic repositioning. Ryan snorted into his coffee. Nice corporate. Speak, Em. I ignored him, focusing on Dad. Think about it practically. You've been wanting to renovate the cabin anyway. This just accelerates the timeline. And being in a new environment, where no one knows you as Robert from Wilson Engineering, might help clarify what you want to do next. Your father doesn't need to decide what's next immediately, Mom added gently. The financial cushion gives us time. Why not use that time somewhere beautiful, doing something constructive? Dad was silent, pushing eggs around his plate with uncharacteristic indecision. Plus, I added, the clincher, you'd be close enough to see Emma regularly. Maybe even help her fix up that apartment disaster of an apartment. There is nothing wrong with my apartment, I protested, right on cue. Your kitchen faucet drips, your closet door sticks, and your bathroom fan sounds like a helicopter taking off. Dad countered immediately, his expertise automatically engaging despite his reluctance. Mom? Ryan and I exchanged subtle smiles. The engineer in him couldn't resist a problem to solve. Over the next few days, the idea solidified from a hypothetical suggestion to a concrete plan. The coastal property closing was still on track, and my parents extended their planned stay. From 3 weeks to indefinite, but at least 3 months. Ryan promised to check on the Minneapolis house regularly, and Melissa, when finally brought into the loop, offered to manage any logistics that needed local attention. The morning. I was set to fly back to Seattle. Dad drove me to the airport. We'd barely spoken directly about his job situation or the extended Washington stay since that first evening. Both of us more comfortable with practical planning than emotional excavation. But as we approached the airport, he unexpectedly pulled into a short-term parking lot rather than the departure drop-off. I'll walk you in, he said, offering no room for argument. Inside the terminal, with time to spare before I needed to clear security, we found a quiet corner in a coffee shop. I never properly thanked you, Dad said suddenly, staring into his black coffee. For what? For coming home when you heard the news. For caring enough to upend your schedule. He cleared his throat awkwardly. For seeing what I needed before I did. The naked gratitude in his voice made my chest tight. That's what families do, Dad. Not all families, he countered. And not always well. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When you were growing up, your mother and I tried to provide stability, structure. We thought that's what good parents did. I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. But with you, he continued, our structure sometimes felt like a constraint, didn't it? Your energy, your need to explore and question, we didn't always know how to channel that constructively. The insight surprised me. I'd never thought my parents were that self-aware about our occasional clashes. I didn't make it easy, I acknowledged. You weren't supposed to, Dad said, something like pride flickering in his eyes. You were supposed to challenge us, push boundaries. That's how children grow. How families grow. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. What I'm trying to say, badly, is that I'm grateful you didn't let distance change who you are to this family. You're still our hurricane, even from Seattle. Sometimes that means disrupting our comfortable patterns, like suggesting we essentially move across the country temporarily. Are you still unsure about the plan? I asked. Terrified, he admitted with surprising candor. I've never been without a defined professional role. I've never had to reinvent myself at this stage of life. But, he looked up, meeting my eyes. Directly. If my daughter can fly across the country and build a new life while still remaining connected to her roots, perhaps her old man can learn something from that example. The departure announcement for my flight interrupted the moment. As we stood to say goodbye, Dad pulled me into a hug tighter and longer than his usual brief embraces. We'll see you in a few weeks, he said as we separated. Try to fix that leaky faucet before we arrive. Not a chance, I replied with a grin. I'm saving all home repairs for expert consultation. As I went through security and headed to my gate, I reflected on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd stood frozen outside my childhood home, devastated by overheard words about the peace my absence had brought. Now my parents were preparing for an extended stay near Seattle, a disruption to their peaceful routine they were choosing willingly, even enthusiastically. Perhaps that was the true lesson in all of this. Sometimes the hurricane energy that disturbs the peace also clears the way for necessary change. Sometimes what looks like chaos from one perspective is actually growth in disguise. By the time my flight took off, climbing above the Minneapolis winter landscape, I felt a peculiar sense of completion. The journey that had begun with pain and misunderstanding had evolved into something I couldn't have anticipated. A new configuration of family bonds, stretching across geography, but perhaps stronger for having been tested. Gazing out the airplane window as Minnesota receded below, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth that had been emerging gradually over these past months. Maybe I'd needed to leave home not just to pursue professional opportunities, but to discover that the very qualities that had sometimes made me feel like an outsider in my own family, my intensity, my restlessness, my propensity for stirring things up, were actually gifts I could offer back to them when they needed perspective beyond their comfortable patterns. And perhaps the greatest surprise of all was discovering that my hurricane nature, which I'd feared might drive me permanently away from my family's orbit, had instead created an unexpected current, drawing us together in new ways. A force not just of disruption, but of positive transformation. As the plane leveled off above the clouds, I pulled out my laptop to begin drafting my next column. The working title came to me instantly. When Peace Isn't Progress, the necessary disruptions that move us forward. Sometimes it seems being the one who disturbs the peace is exactly what a family needs. 1 year later, I stood on the deck of my parents' coastal cabin, no longer really a cabin after months of Dad's meticulous renovations, watching the Pacific. Sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and pink. The spring air carried the scent of salt and the distant calls of seagulls, a symphony so different from the suburban sounds of my childhood. "Penny for your thoughts," Dad said, joining me, at the railing with 2 mugs of coffee. I accepted one gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. "Just thinking about how much has changed in a year." Dad nodded, his gaze following mine to the horizon. He looked younger somehow, despite the additional gray in his hair. The haunted, defeated expression he'd worn after the forced retirement had been replaced by something lighter, more at peace. The temporary 3-month stay had stretched to 6, then 8. Eventually, my parents had made a decision that surprised everyone, including themselves. They would split their time between Minneapolis and Washington, spending spring and summer on the coast and returning to their Minnesota home for fall and winter. Dad had found an unexpected second act consulting for small engineering firms and mentoring engineering students at the local community college. The work engaged his expertise without the corporate politics that had dominated his former position. More importantly, it allowed him to set his own schedule, to work on his own terms. Mom had blossomed too, joining a local garden club and volunteering at the town library. She'd made friends with a speed that impressed even me, the self-proclaimed extrovert of the family. "Did I ever tell you," Dad said thoughtfully, "that your mother and I had our first real argument here?" About 4 months after we moved in, I turned to him surprised. My parents rarely argued, at least not where the kids could witness it. "What about?" She wanted to repaint the living room. I'd just finished painting it exactly the shade of blue she'd originally requested. He chuckled at the memory. I told her it was ridiculous to change it. She said she'd lived with the color long enough to know it wasn't right. "Let me guess who won that argument," I smiled. "Of course she did," Dad confirmed with a rueful shake of his head. "But it wasn't really about the paint. It was about—" He paused, searching for the right words, establishing that this place was ours to shape however we wanted. No history, no expectations, just new decisions we could make together. I considered this a reset button. "Exactly," he nodded, "which is what I needed more than I realized." Inside the house, the sounds of laughter drifted through the open windows. Ryan had flown in yesterday with his now fiancée Tara. Melissa and Jake had arrived this morning with news they were expecting their first child. It was the first time in over a year that the entire Taylor family was gathered under one roof, a milestone we'd decided was worth celebrating. "Do you ever miss the peace and quiet?" I asked, only half joking. "Before the Taylor hurricane force descended for the weekend?" Dad considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. "There's something to be said for peace," he acknowledged. "Your mother and I have enjoyed our quiet mornings, our uninterrupted evenings." My heart sank slightly, despite knowing better. Old insecurities died hard. "But," he continued, turning to face me fully, "there's a difference between peace and stagnation, between quiet and emptiness." He gestured toward the house where more laughter erupted. "That noise in there? That's life happening. Messy, unpredictable, occasionally exhausting life." "Hurricane Emma and Associates," I quipped. "Exactly." Dad nodded, his expression serious despite his smile. "You know what hurricanes do, besides cause destruction? They clear away what's dead or dying. They make space for new growth." I blinked, touched by the metaphor and the insight behind it. "If you hadn't stirred things up, first by leaving, then by overhearing what you did, then by challenging us to think differently, we'd still be in Minneapolis, stuck in routines that were comfortable but not necessarily fulfilling." Dad took a sip of his coffee. "Sometimes the people who disrupt our peace are the ones who love us enough to not let us settle." The sliding door opened before I could respond, and Mom stepped onto the deck. "Dinner's almost ready," she announced. "Ryan's trying to convince everyone that he was the one who suggested the meal plan, but we all know who the real chef in the family is." Dad winked at me. "That would be Tara." "I heard that," Ryan called from inside. Mom rolled her eyes affectionately. "Stop monopolizing Emma, Robert. Everyone wants time with her." As they playfully bickered their way back inside, I lingered for a moment longer on the deck, absorbing the scene before me. The house alive with family voices, the setting sun casting everything in golden light, the unfamiliar yet familiar feeling of being surrounded by the people who knew me best. 1 year ago, I stood frozen outside a different family home, devastated by words that seemed to confirm my worst fears. That my absence brought peace, that my presence disrupted it. The journey from that moment to this one had been complicated, painful at times, but ultimately transformative. I'd learned that being disruptive wasn't necessarily negative, that sometimes stirring things up was exactly what a situation needed. I'd discovered that distance, whether geographic or emotional, could provide perspective impossible to gain from within familiar patterns. Most importantly, I'd realized that family bonds were more elastic and resilient, than I'd given them credit for, capable of stretching across miles and circumstances without breaking. The house might indeed feel peaceful without me sometimes. My family's lives continued in my absence, finding their own rhythms and patterns. But that peace wasn't better or worse than the energy I brought, just different. And now we'd found a new configuration that honored both realities. As I finally turned to join the chaos inside, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "How's the family reunion going? Column still on track for Monday?" I smiled and typed back, "All good." Working title: The Value of Disruption, Finding Growth Beyond Comfort Zones. Her response came quickly. "Perfect. Your best insights always come from that hurricane energy of yours." Slipping my phone back into my pocket, I stepped through the doorway into the warm, noisy heart of the gathering. Ryan immediately draped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me into a debate about the best local restaurants to visit during the weekend. Melissa showed me ultrasound photos while Jake and Dad discussed the merits of various wood finishes for the nursery furniture Dad was determined to build for his first grandchild. Mom caught my eye across the room, her expression content, yet knowing. A silent acknowledgement of the journey we'd all traveled to reach this moment. She raised her glass slightly in my direction, a toast only I could see. To hurricanes and peaceful harbors, her eyes seemed to say. To finding room for both. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.